Now, while I am a fan of modern handheld emulator consoles at my core, I am still definitely a modder. So getting the opportunity to mod something new is definitely a plus for me, and that is what I have done here. This is my TrimUI Brick, but not as you know it. I've upgraded it with a set of yellow custom buttons and an awesome laser engraved rear faceplate, and in this video I'm going to show you how I installed them. Alright, so it is no secret that the TrimUI Brick is one of my favourite handheld consoles released last year. I absolutely love this thing. It's like a tiny little homage to the Analog Pocket, and it plays all of my favourite Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance and more really, really well. I went for the white one. There was also a black edition out at the time, and since then they've released a red and purple edition which also look awesome. But I was always quite a fan of the white one, and when I had it in hand it looked great. But when LITNXT got in touch with me about trying out some custom buttons, well, I couldn't resist. So I went with yellow to go with my kind of channel theme, and also I've got this cool laser engraved Joe Bleeps logo on the back of it. How good does that look? So in this video I'm going to be showing you how I installed them. That involves taking this entire console apart, and it was the first time I'd done that. I didn't have any instructions, so I was just kind of finding my way through it and taking my time, and I'll explain what I did as I go. This is an extremely well built console. When I was first testing it, it felt really solid, and opening up and looking inside kind of reaffirms just how well designed and well built this thing is. It definitely deserves all of the credit it's getting. Anyway, how did I fit all these custom bits? Let's take a look. Alright, so looking at the standard setup, most of the buttons on it are originally grey, apart from the two clear function buttons at the front and the turquoise power switch on the side. So we've got the grey D-pad A, B, X and Y with the two clear LED function buttons on the front, in the middle, and at the bottom we've got home, start and select. There's a grey function switch and a turquoise power switch on the right, and there's volume up and down in grey on the left. On the back of the console we've got the TrimUI Brick logo, which is on the metal plate. We've got swappable shoulder buttons. These were originally grey, but I've swapped them out for some frosted transparent ones which show off the LEDs a little more effectively. And here are our new upgrades. I've got a brand new set of buttons and a new backplate with the Joe Bleeps logo engraved on both sides. Now this is layered thicknesses, so there's only one way around this can be installed, so I'm assuming the one on the inside was maybe a test engraving, and then they do the final engraving on the outer. The laser engraving on this looks really good. It's very high quality and looks crisp, and I just love how my logo looks on there. Looking at the buttons themselves, they appear to be moulded resin with mostly clear plastic and a coloured layer near the top. I chose yellow to match my channel theme, but there's lots of different colours available. The mouldings of the buttons and the parts match the original buttons, with the A, B, X and Y indented on the buttons themselves, the logo on the D-pad and so on. Now I went for yellow because I'm a sucker for yellow, but I was also quite tempted to go for all white to give it much more of an Analog Pocket aesthetic. So the kit includes the D-pad, A, B, X and Y buttons, the lower three buttons which are on a single sprue, volume plus and minus on separate buttons. There's the power button which has a little clip attached, two front LED buttons which are also in yellow. Now I wasn't sure if this was going to work because obviously these buttons need to light up, and I wasn't sure if it was going to block the light, but seeing as I've got all the stuff in the kit, I decided I was going to install everything and just see how it all looks, and then at a later date I can customize it and change it and swap it. And that's the advantage of these things, isn't it? You can pick and choose which parts you include, which bits you don't, and you can fully customize it to your own bespoke design. There's also an extra tiny little button which at first I wasn't sure what it was for, but it's for the reset button on the bottom edge of the console. So looking at my kit, I had the D-pad, the LED buttons, A, B, X and Y, the home, start and select assembly, the reset button for the base, volume up and volume down, and the power button. There's unfortunately no replacement for the sliding function switch on the side of the console, so you're going to have to keep that one in grey. So as I say, I decided to fit everything, review it, and then possibly customize at a later date. Now this was a fantastic excuse to finally get a peep inside what the TrimUI Brick actually looks like. First of all, I had to shut it down. You just do this by pressing and holding the power button till a little menu appears. You choose power off and it switches off. To open it up, you need a Torx Type star bit, which is a T6. So I used my Hoto driver with the T6H bit, which is the hollow one, very useful for the Xbox controllers. But in this case, these screws don't have the little pin, so a regular T6 will do absolutely fine. So I laid it flat on a soft mouse mat to avoid scratching it. I used a small dish, which I got from Lab 15, which is awesome to keep my screws safe. And the screws are self-tapping, they're quite pointy on the end, so do be careful when they're going back in. They're all the same length, which makes things much easier. You don't get mixed up as to which one goes where. There are 6 screws to remove before you can open it up, 4 on the plastic shell and 2 on the metal plate. Removing the shoulder buttons from the back is quite easy. They just slide up, and I pop mine off with a plastic spudger. Having never taken one of these apart before, I was quite cautious, so I pulled it apart very carefully, and it will come apart. The metal plate is wedged in quite tightly, so it gives a little bit of resistance, but if you take your time, just give a gentle wiggle, the 2 parts will come separately. Now, they're not completely separate. There is a cable from the battery connecting the 2 halves, so pull that one out carefully, and then you've got both halves separate, and we can get our first look inside the brick. First off, looking at the back plate, this is attached to the back from the inside with 2 small crosshead screws. Now, if this is the only part you're replacing, it is actually a super easy job, because you just need to open up the console, swap that part over, and put it back together without having to even interfere with the motherboard at all. Obviously, as is the case here, I was definitely going to open up the whole thing because I was replacing all the buttons too, so I decided to go with doing the buttons first and then leave the back plate till later. So the front section has the motherboard screwed in place, again with those crosshead screws. First of all, take out your SD card, which might get in the way when you're trying to remove the motherboard later. I swapped my driver bit to a PH0. Now, disassembling this thing does involve a few steps. There's a number of cables and clips that you need to disconnect, as well as removing screws before you can lift out the motherboard. So there's a power cable clipped to the top of the motherboard for powering the rear LED unit. There's 2 crosshead screws holding the LED assembly in place, and there's a horizontal ribbon cable connector for the screen. There's 3 crosshead screws near the control pad area. With all of this stuff in place, before I actually started disassembling it, I took a reference photo. Now, when you're doing any sort of job like that, this is always a good idea to help you with a goal for where you're heading for your reassembly later on when you've got all these parts all over your desk. So I removed all 5 crosshead screws, and again, these were all the same size. I carefully lifted off the LED power cable with a spudger, lifted the motherboard up for a quick peep inside, and decided I needed to unclip the ribbon cable for the screen. So this folds up from the top to release the cable. I also carefully pulled out the 2 cables on the lower left for the stereo speakers, and then removed the motherboard by tilting out from the top and sliding out the USB-C port and headphone socket from the bottom. As you lift it out, carefully slide out the ribbon cable from its slot so the screen can stay secured in place. Then we can have a good look at the front of the motherboard, so you can have a peep at that if you were curious. So looking inside the shell, we've got the function switch, which we don't have a replacement for. This is next to the power button, which has a silicon pad mounted onto it. Volume are both on a connected piece, unlike the kit where we've got separate buttons. There is the reset button at the bottom, home, start and select on a single sprue again, the LED function buttons, and removing the 2 big silicon membranes reveals the buttons and the D-pad are actually attached in place on the surface of the membranes themselves. That's a push fit to slot them in place, so you definitely get them the right way around. I used tweezers and a spudger to help lift everything out. First of all, took out the home, start, select assembly and put the new buttons in. The finish on the buttons appears to be really good. Looking at the clear function buttons, the new ones are yellow but clear at the back. I was planning to keep the original ones, but for testing this, I decided I was going to install everything. I can always replace them later, as it hadn't been too difficult to open up at this point. The reset was really securely in place and was quite tricky to get out. I had difficulty getting the new one in place as the internal part seemed a little bit thick. Now, closer inspection revealed a slight bump on the surface, like an inaccuracy from the molding. That was quite easy for me to trim with a knife, and then it slotted in okay and clicked in place. Now, removing the power button was tricky. The build of the brick is very solid. Everything is securely in place. So I had to detach the silicon plug first, and then I could lever the button out. The new one is all in one piece, but it clicked in place okay with the assistance of a spudger. So I reassembled the original power button with its silicon pad so I didn't end up losing it. There's no replacement for the function switch, so that stays grey, which is a shame, but maybe swapping out some buttons later will mean that it doesn't look too out of place. Again, the volume buttons are very firmly clipped in place. It feels like they may be put in place before the screen goes in, and then the screen holds puts them in position, so you need to apply a little bit of force to get them out. I took my time, as of course I didn't want to end up accidentally damaging the screen. It's actually testament to the build quality of the TrimUI Brick just how securely all of these parts are held in place, even if it is a bit of a pain to get them all out again. So I eventually prized them out with a spudger, but it did take a while. Whenever anything like this is happening to you, don't get frustrated, come away from it if you need to, take your time and don't just get rash and force anything. That is always when you end up making mistakes. Putting the new ones in was much easier, but as they didn't have the connecting part, it was quite hard to keep them in place without them tumbling back out again. I put the D-pad onto the silicone membrane next. Now I advise making sure that the silicone parts slot in perfectly. Mine ended up in the bottom half a little bit more than the top half when I was testing later, so I'm going to need to open it up and adjust it, but it does slot in quite neatly. Make sure the D-pad is the right way around. I checked from a previous photo, it's got the 2 hexagons at the bottom and the 1 at the top for the TrimUI logo, so I put that in and got it the right way around. A, B, X and Y again slot neatly onto the silicone pad. I laid the 2 silicone pads face down in position, made sure any wires were out of the way from the speakers, and made sure that the pads mounted onto the little pins to locate them correctly. To put the motherboard back in position, I fed the ribbon cable through from the screen, held the speaker wires out of the way, pushed the USB-C and headphone socket in place first, and then lowered the motherboard. At this point the volume buttons needed realigning, so I did that and tilted it on its side to accommodate the motherboard, and it needed a little bit of force to push it in place near the power switch. I didn't like doing this, but it did end up working fine, thankfully. So when I flipped it over and looked at the front, the colours looked a little bit more muted than I'd originally anticipated. This is because it's got the black silicone pads and the black motherboard behind it, so it loses a little bit of that vibrance, but that said, I still think it looks pretty awesome. Once the motherboard was in place, I put the 3 screws in. Now whenever you're putting the screws back into the plastic, you don't want to ruin the thread that's in there, so the right technique for doing that is to undo the screw first until you feel a little pop as it locates on the thread, and then nip it up. Now once those 3 screws are in place, I noticed that the volume and power buttons have misaligned again, so I spent some time correcting those very carefully, and when I checked the power switch, it engaged really well. I put the plastic cover for the LEDs at the top and popped the 2 screws in place. After that I had a few bits to plug in place. The LED cable at the top, I aligned it with tweezers and then just pushed it down with my thumb until it clicked. For the screen cable, I checked that the ribbon cable click was lifted first, slotted the cable in place, and then carefully folded the clip down and clicked it in position. Then I pushed the 2 speaker cable plugs back in. This was nice and easy. After that, I moved on to the rear assembly to fit the new backplate. I undid the 2 crosshead screws first, removed the panel, and then slid off the 4 rear buttons. These slid easily onto the new panel, and it lowered in place, making sure that the pins aligned with the holes. It needs careful wiggling into position, but once it's in place, hold it down with your thumb and put the screws in. Again, get them in properly by unscrewing first until you feel that little pop, and then fasten them in position. Even on first inspection, this backplate looked really good. So before reassembly, I reinserted the battery cable, aligned the front and back halves, and it slotted together really well. The new backplate was an excellent fit. I swapped back to the T6 bit and then put all 6 screws back in place. I did this gently at first and then nipped it up while holding the 2 parts firmly together. Just tighten them up until they stop. You definitely don't want to go over tightening screws into plastic. So I put the SD card back in and the buttons were looking really good. The reset button on the bottom really stood out. I put the caps back onto the rear buttons, which is just a push fit, and I was ready for doing a little bit of testing. So first of all, switching on, the power switch worked fine and felt okay. Obviously without the silicone layer, there's a slightly harder feel to press in it, but it worked absolutely fine. As you can see, I've ended up with a MinUI boot screen from a failed attempt at installing MinUI, even though the SD card I'm using is still a prototype crossmix one from LITNXT. So the LEDs were still very visible on the front buttons, but it altered the color. They've ended up with a slight green tint while the main LEDs are a sort of bluish white, so it doesn't actually match the LEDs on the back and the top. On testing, thankfully all the buttons behaved correctly. Needed a little bit of adjustment on the rear buttons, so I took the caps off and checked the buttons themselves. They were all fine, so I put them back on, a little bit of wiggling, they were working fine when they were reseated. I tested it on Pop and Music GB Animation Melody, which is one of my current favourites. It's quite intensive with its use of the D-pad and the buttons, and I could tell everything was really responsive. The buttons were looking and feeling really good. Gave it another quick test on Tetris Rosy Retrospection, and the buttons and D-pad were behaving correctly, and then a quick go on Mario Land 2 DX. I noticed then that the D-pad wasn't entirely sitting flat. It felt okay to play, but even with a little bit of pressure, it wouldn't sit flat. So I'm planning to swap out the function buttons back to the clear ones. So when I've got it all open, I'll just double check the accuracy of how I'd attach the silicone pad to the D-pad. If worst comes to the worst, I can swap back to the grey one, but I'm pretty sure it'll be fine. Did a final check with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, which gave a full workout on all the buttons, and again, everything felt great. So it's all done, it's back together, thankfully everything is still working, and I think it looks pretty great, particularly the backplate. This thing looks fantastic. So having this TrimUI Brick with my logo on the back and my colour scheme on the buttons really makes this feel like quite a personal custom console, and I really like it. I've been enjoying playing on it, and the buttons thankfully feel great, just like the original ones did. Really responsive and no problems as yet. As I said, they're not quite as bright and vibrant as I'd originally anticipated, so I was a little disappointed with that at first, but now I've been playing on it for a while, I do think it still looks great, and it's a marked difference from the original grey buttons. As I said, I am going to make a few changes. I'm going to double check the level of this D-pad to get that a bit more even. I'm going to, although they look great in yellow when it's switched off, I'm going to unfortunately have to remove these two so that my LED colours end up matching the ones on the back. Now, one other thing is when you plug this thing in and it charges, the power button lights up. Now, this is much more transparent than the original power button, so it lets a lot of light through. So when it's charging, this thing is really, really bright. That might be fine for you, but for me, I think I'm going to change back to the original power button. Also, it means I'll be able to keep the little silicone pad, and I'll have that slightly softer tactile feel when I'm switching it on. Also, I don't know, it worked fine, but it felt like it was maybe under a little bit too much pressure, and I didn't want to cause it any damage. So yeah, in terms of the changes I'm making, I'm swapping back to the original power button, I'm swapping back to the original two function buttons on the front, I'm going to reseat the silicone pad on the D-pad, but other than that, I'm keeping it as it is. I love it. White and yellow. I wasn't sure if it was going to work. It works great. I think this would look awesome on a black one as well. Black with the yellow buttons would just look epic, but I do like the lighter colour consoles, and I'm happy with how this one looks. So as I say, I got these parts custom made for me and sent for review by LITNXT. You can get those for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description. Also, if you're buying anything from them, if you use the code JOEBLEEPS at the checkout, you'll get yourself 10% off. It is an affiliate link, so anything you buy will help support my channel as well at no extra cost to you. So yeah, now my TrimUI Brick is even better. This, as I said before, is an absolutely fantastic little console. If you want to find out a little bit more about it, I've made a video previously. You can go and check that out up here. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.